In Unit 6, we're going to be learning about quadrilaterals. Now, I'm going to briefly show you the quadrilateral family tree, which consists of the different types of quadrilaterals we will be seeing throughout the unit. Quadrilaterals, as you know, are four-sided polygons. They can be divided into kites, parallelograms, and trapezoids. Now, we're going to begin by focusing on parallelograms, and then within parallelograms, you also have your rhombus, your rectangles, and your squares. So throughout the chapter, we're going to be adding a little bit more to these quadrilaterals as we go. Today, we're going to begin with parallelograms and their properties. So the main thing to know about parallelograms is that their opposite sides are parallel. That's why they're called parallelograms. Their opposite sides are also congruent. Opposite angles are also congruent. Remember, when I say opposite, I mean the ones that are opposite or across from each other, kind of like at a diagonal, if you're looking at angles. So for example, if you look at the angles in this picture over here, angle E would be congruent to angle G. Angle H would be congruent to angle F. So that's what I mean by opposite angles. Consecutive angles are supplementary. So in other words, if you're looking side by side, that's what I mean by consecutive, they'll add up to 180. Remember, supplementary means they add to 180. So for example, here, the measure of angle E plus the measure of angle H is going to equal 180. So those two angles, when you add them up, will equal 180. So if they're opposite, they're going to be congruent. If they're side by side or consecutive, they sum to 180. And then another thing here that we want to focus on is the diagonals. The diagonals of parallelograms bisect each other. If you remember earlier in the year, we learned that bisect means to cut in half. So if you look at this picture here, these diagonals cut each other in half. So this half is congruent to this half, and then this half would be congruent to this half. So those are the main things we're going to be learning, including that opposite sides are congruent. And we're going to be using these to answer several questions about parallelograms. So here are some examples. If we look at this first picture, it's telling us to find the value of each variable. Well, let's begin with the sides. I know that this side is congruent to this side. So since they're congruent, they're equal. So I could write an equation 2a is equal to 34. And then if you wanted to solve for a there, all you would do is divide by 2. So a would equal 17. Likewise, we can write an equation using the angles. We know opposite angles are congruent. So here AB has to equal 112. So if I divide that by 8, for B, I get 14. We look at example 2. Here we're dealing with diagonals. They want us to find the value of x and y. So I know that this diagonal right here is congruent to this one. So I could say 18 equals 4y. And then I could divide by 4. So y is equal to 18 fourths. We could simplify this if we divide by 2. And we'll get 9 halves. So you could say y is equal to 9 halves. If you want to write it as a decimal, you could also say y is equal to 4.5. Now if I look at my other diagonals, this diagonal here with 6x would be congruent to 24. So 6x equals 24. If I divide that by 6, I get 4 as my answer for x. So we're just using the properties here to help us solve some problems. Here we're going to use the properties to continue solving problems. So in example 1, I know that opposite angles are congruent. So if this angle is 90 degrees, this one here must also be 90 degrees. So 3x has to equal 90. So x is equal to 30. Now, I don't have an angle opposite y, but I know that consecutive angles or angles that are side by side are supplementary. So I know that this angle here and this angle here are going to sum to 180 degrees. So I could say 4y plus, since this is a right angle 90, is going to equal 180 degrees. And now I have an equation I can solve for y. So here, if I do 90 divided by 4, I get 22.5 for y. In example 2, I'm going to begin with the sides. So we know opposite sides are congruent. So 8y equals 88. And if we divide by 8, we get 11 for y. Now I'm going to move on to the angles. I know opposite angles are also congruent. So this is 90. This must also be 90. So I can say 6x equals 90. And if I divide that by 6, I get my answer for x, which is 15. We look at example 3. I'm going to begin with the angles I do know. So I know these two angles here are congruent. But if you look, one has an x, one has a y. So we really can't do anything with that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group some of the other angles. So here I can group the angles on this side. And I know they're going to add to 180 degrees because they're side by side or consecutive. So I can add the 55, the 60, and the 2y. So I'm going to do 55 plus 60 plus 2y. And I know together all of those are going to add up to 180. So I'm going to start making this solder. If I do 55 plus 60, that's 115. Next, I can subtract 115 from both sides. This gives me 65. And I can divide by 2 to get my answer for y. So for y, I get 32.5. Now that I know y, I can actually use that to find x. So I'm going to plug this in here. So this is 2y. 2 times 32.5 is 65 degrees. So I know this angle here is 65 degrees. And then these two angles are congruent. So now I know 5x is going to equal 65 degrees. So now I have an equation I can write for x. And if I solve that for x, I get 13. If we look at the next example, it's also dealing with angles. So I'm going to write an equation using the ones that have x's. Because I know like here 3y and 12x are congruent. But I can't solve for x or y if there's two variables in the equation. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to pair these that are side by side. Because I know if they're side by side, they add to 180 degrees. So I can say 6x plus 12x equals 180. If I combine these, I get 18x equals 180. So my answer for x is going to be 10. Now that I know that answer, I can plug it in. So I want these two now because I know they're going to be congruent. So let me plug in x to 12x. So 12x would become 12 times 10 or 120 degrees. So this is 120 degrees. So now I can say 3y equals 120 degrees. And if I divide by 3, I get 40 as my answer for y. Now let's focus on diagonals. I know that the diagonals bisect each other, so they're cut into 2 equal halves. So for example, here, this 3x would be equal to 12. So x is equal to 4. And then 4y would be equal to 8. So y is equal to 2. Let's go ahead and look at this last picture. So here again, we know that diagonals bisect each other. So here I know that 2y is going to be equal to 28. So y is equal to 14. And I also know that 4x is going to equal this side. But if you notice, they marked this with this congruent symbol. So actually, this would also equal 28. All four of these diagonal pieces are going to be congruent. So we can also say that 4x equals 28. So if we divide by 4, for x our answer is 7. So all we did here is we used the properties of parallelograms to solve equations for variables. So you know that opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent. If the angles are side by side or consecutive, they're supplementary. And then the diagonals bisect each other, cut each other into two equal halves. So those are the main things you need to know in order to solve problems dealing with parallelograms.